Hello students, welcome to the Analyst. I hope you're doing well. Today is 3rd of September and we'll look at 5 important articles from the Indian Express and the Hindu. Now the first article that we'll discuss is irrigation. Then we'll look at money laundering. Then we'll look at corruption. Finally, we'll look at two prelim based. One is the case study, the other is the solar mission. Now, let's look at irrigation, and this pertains to your GS3, primarily agriculture. Now, let's look at what is irrigation. So, it is a human intervention. A human intervention to do what? To provide water to farms or to aid agricultural activities, and it is an assurance of water so that you can sow and till your crops, so you can sow and till your fields, right? Now, what is the context? It is seen that 75% of India's irrigation sources run on electricity, right? That means irrigation is over the period of time increasing in its electrification. And we'll understand how this is adversely affecting our groundwater. Now, why do we need irrigation? So first is monsoon. So our southwest monsoon is 3-month centric, right? So 75% of the rain that we get is in 3 to 4 months, right? This we show like a rain peak in the entire year. Then it is extremely uncertain. Why? Because some regions will have burst of monsoon or breaks in monsoon. So suddenly monsoon can stop. It can go for a late burst or it can start early. So all those things. Then it is unreliable. Why? Because it is a seasonal cycle. Then it is also having a yearly cycle. Now the seasons can be delayed, yes, and the years can also vary. For example, some years it may be a El Nino year, or it can be a La Nina year, or it can be a neutral year, right? How it affects agriculture and why agriculture is so important. It is because India is primarily rural and the Bharata or the rural India is primarily agrarian. So when you have more than 60% people directly and indirectly dependent on agriculture, what happens? Irrigation becomes important. Why? Because irrigation is an input to agriculture. And what did we say? That it is about assurance. So if you are assured about water, if you are assured about the seeds, then what happens? You can plan your fields, you can plan your agricultural activities in the upcoming seasons, right? Now, naturally, it affects the crop choices. So let's say the prices of sugar is going high, right? So it is but natural that I can take up sugarcane. But I will take up sugarcane only if my field allows, and my field must have water. And I cannot be dependent upon only monsoon water because there are variations, right? On the other hand, if I do not have that choice, then I may simply go for wheat. And let's say in a particular year, there is glut in wheat. There is overproduction of wheat, very good crop of wheat. Then what happens? Naturally, my incomes, my farm incomes, my family income is affected. And the moment incomes are affected, livelihood and lives are affected. Then we have this typical problem that southwest monsoon gives us 4,000 billion cubic meter of water, right? But we are not able to utilize even 40% of this. We are not even able to use, let's say, 2000 or 2500 billion cubic meters, right? Simultaneously, what do we see? we see that there is falling water table, and we see the disparities in the form of, let's say, Tura in Meghalaya will get 1200 centimeters of rain, while Jaisalmer will get only 8 centimeters of rain. So what is this? This is rain disparity between different regions. So even if I am getting 4000 billion cubic meter of water from rain every year, I am not able to use even 40% of this. So what is the issue? The issue is that I am not assured about irrigation, and India is still hovering around 50% of irrigated area. That means what? That means around 50% of India is rain fed. So the moment I talk about agriculture being rain fed, it is directly dependent on what? On how the southwest monsoon behaves this particular year. And we have seen two examples recently that we discussed. One was incessant floods in Himachal Pradesh, and simultaneously we are staring at drought-like conditions in Maharashtra. So what do we see? That in some parts of India there is excessive rain, in some parts there is drought-like condition, and let's say in both these regions, if the farmers are dependent upon the monsoon, then what happens? Their crops are affected, their cropping choices are affected, and all of that finally affects the farm incomes, which we wish to double. And if it affects the farm income, it directly affects what? It directly affects all your targets, SDG targets of, let's say, poverty, hunger, malnutrition, food security. So what is the idea? The idea is to decrease uncertainty. When we were discussing, let's say, land tenancy, land reforms, we gave the right to farmers, okay, of, let's say, the titles. The moment we give rights of title, what happens? The farmer takes ownership, and once they take ownership, they would invest on the land. Similarly, if I decrease the uncertainty by providing assured irrigation year on year, season on season, then what happens? Then the farmer is able to crop the field depending upon multiple variables, including what the market prices are telling, what is the demand and supply, right? Then we are also looking at productivity. Why? Because we have to take multiple crops. Why do we need multiple crops? Because let's say the India's population has increased like this, but so let's say this is somehow exponential growth, right? But the amount of food that we have grows in a linear fashion. So at some point of time, there can be a very big gap between demand and supply. And if there is a gap between demand and supply of food crops or any crops, then what happens? Inflation happens, right? That is why we create buffer stocks. We save our produce from this year, next year, so that if there is a mismatch in demand and supply, or there are inflationary pressures because of global reasons, then we are able to use our buffer stock, right? So while we are looking at productivity, we must understand that in the future we'll require more food crops as well as non-food crops. Also, we need diversity in our crops, diversity in our farming. That means there'll be increased demand for, let's say, eggs. There'll be increased demand for, let's say, protein enriched foods. There'll be more demand for wheat, rice, pulses, everything, right? So we must ensure that there is higher productivity, and that is the idea behind more from less, or going for farm use efficiency. So getting more from the same land. Why? Because over the period of time, let's say we have a common land of our family. And over the period of time, what happens? Fragmentation. So the per capita availability of land with each farmer will over the period of time naturally fall because of increasing population. And until we look at our population going to the optimum level and maybe saturating, right? So this will continue happening. And if this happens, then what happens? So a big farm turns into a smaller farm. Now, what is the idea? The idea is to get more from less. That means even if I have low size of land, I should get more productivity out of it. Furthermore, I also need to increase my gross cropped area. That means I have to take multiple crops. Now, let's take an example. Let's say I live in the Ganga plains. So in the Gangetic plains, what happens? You have Bahufasli Zameen, okay? You can take up, let's say, 3 crops. But unfortunately, if you do not have assured irrigation and simultaneously you are facing the vagaries of nature, then what happens? So you would take 2 crops or 1.5 crops on an average, right? In a decadal term, if we can say. So it totally affects not only the farm incomes, but overall food security of India as well. That is why irrigation is must. Now, simultaneously, we must also look at the issue of dry lands, arid regions, semi-arid regions. Just few minutes back, we were talking about Marathwada. So Marathwada, Vidarbh, the region of Marusthali, the region of, let's say, Kutch, the regions of, let's say, Chambal Basin. If these regions are somehow facing, or the Telangana plateau, so if they are facing some kind of water scarcity, water stress, then what happens? If I provide them with assured irrigation, then naturally the farmers will have more choice, right? And finally, it will augment what? The farm incomes. So the idea for doubling farm income. Now, let's look at the types of irrigation. So when we are talking about tube well and well, what are we essentially doing? So in a well, I am basically digging a hole, right? And let's say this is a groundwater level. So groundwater will naturally percolate into the well. Also, when rainwater happens, so a lot of surface runoff will go inside the well and it will be stored. So it is essentially for storing. But how will I use the water? Through, let's say, some pump or tube well. Now, what about tube wells? So I am going deeper. So over the period of time, what the article was referring, that with more and more electrification, what is happening, that we are going for deeper and deeper pumps, more powerful pumps. And so what is happening? It is leading to more depletion of groundwater. And what did we discuss? So MS Swaminathan said that groundwater should be used at the last resort. But what are we seeing? That tube well and well together, they account for 62% of India's irrigation. That means out of the 50% of India which is irrigated, more than 25% is dependent on well and tube well, right? And then we are looking at canals. So what is a canal? So let's say a river is going, right? We divert some water from the river into a main canal, and then we build feeder canals which branch out into our fields. And so whenever there is excess water in the mainstream, then it also becomes a method to control some floods, while it is also looking at irrigation. Now, what do we mean by tank? So tank, here I am building a, let's say, concrete structure, or I am finding a gap, let's say, between 2 rocks. And usually tanks are taken up in peninsular India because of the hard rock structure. When we look at tube well and well, it is usually near river basins as well as near, let's say, some moist regions where the groundwater is available and it is usable groundwater. Where do we go and use canals? When I need to move some water from the mainstream and distribute it. So the easiest and most decentralized method of irrigation can be seen. Let's say I give you more freedom. So, and I give you more localization. So this is the best example of more localization and more freedom. Why? Because I can open my pump set and I can pump my water into the fields. What happens with the canal? I will only get water, let's say once in a day, okay, depending upon a routine. What about tank? Tank, I'm trying to tap into, let's say, some groundwater and also saving some, let's say, rainwater. What about drip? So drip is the model that has come from arid regions and semi-arid regions. Best use has been done in Israel. And the idea is of targeted delivery of nutrition. So water is a nutrient. Similarly, it's an input for any crop. Similarly, we can also go for fertigation, chemigation. So any chemicals, pesticides that you want to provide, it can happen through drips. So in drip, what do we do? So let's say there is a tank. So this tank will take a main thrust pipe and multiple pipes, and through these pipes there will be drips attached, and these drips will drop wise deliver water, drop wise. Now we are also coming up with sensor based drip. So let's say AI tells us what is the localized condition based upon GPS and some soil moisture monitors. So based upon inputs from the localized field, what we'll do, we will regulate the speed of dripping. So more advanced forms of irrigation are also coming up. Now let's look at what are the issues with each type of irrigation. So whenever we are talking about drip, so it is extremely capital intensive. So the first time you have to go for high capital investment. Second is maintenance is also costly. And its know-how is a little rare amongst farmers. So capital intensive, but where it can be used most efficiently in regions which are arid, let's say Marusthali in Rajasthan, semi-arid, let's say Marathwada, Vidarbha, then drylands. So all these regions which are suffering from water stress, water scarcity and are going for agriculture, there we can use drip irrigation. What about tank based irrigation? What are the issues with the tank? So again, tank is somehow dependent upon what? Some form of groundwater. Also, it also becomes a breeding ground for mosquitoes. And it only favors regions which have hard rocks. So the moment the soil is soft and the stratum is a little soft, then what happens? You again shift towards well, tube well, canal. What about canal? So it is reeking with corruption. Why? Because it is a horizontal project. So there is lot of land acquisition involved. Also, it faces a lot of delays, interstate issues. Why? Because of the orientation. Then many canals have created issues between states. Let's say between Punjab and Haryana, Delhi. Example, Satluj, Yamuna link canal. But the best example of canal that has done wonders is the Indira Gandhi canal, which brings water from the Indus River system towards the Marusthali region. What are the issues? So, soil salinization. What else? Subpar capacity. Even if too much money is spent, it is not being used at the full capacity, right? Now, what about wells and tube wells? So they are directly responsible for groundwater depletion as well as groundwater pollution. And over the period of time, there is competitive use of large pumps. Also, we'll see that a lot of state governments will provide subsidies to own, let's say, a pump, or even in use of electricity for agricultural purposes. So all these issues remain. Now, what ought to be done? So, region specific irrigation has to be taken up, which simultaneously fulfills the economics. That means it should be viable. Then ecology. That means it should not have appreciable adverse effects, and simultaneously it must appreciate the nuances of physical setting. So we cannot go for canals in, let's say, the peninsular India. So it must appreciate the local physical setting, the ecology and the economics. And most importantly, there must be time, investment, as well as its full utility. So over the period of time, what we are looking, that many irrigation projects are delayed. The investments are huge in terms of billions of dollars, and the utility is compromised. Let's say it is running at 50% capacity or 30% capacity. And this particularly is the case for canals, right? Let's now look at the second article, and this pertains to your GS3, money laundering and its prevention. Now, why this is in news is because the Jet Airways chairman has been arrested for money laundering by ED. Now, what do we mean by money laundering? So, I should have some illicit or maybe some dirty money. And B, I want to somehow save it from the authorities. And finally, I want to utilize it. How? By integrating it into the financial system. So I will do some illicit work. There I'll make some dirty money. Then I want to bypass the authorities. I do not wish to pay tax or get on in the eyes of the authorities. And finally, I want to utilize it by integrating it back into the financial system so that I can clearly use my money. So layering off, let's say, some dirty money again into white money into the financial system. Now, why money is laundered? So if I am getting excessive profits, let's say someone is earning 50 lakhs, so that person will pay 30% tax, okay? But let's say somehow the person can show an income of, let's say, 10 lakhs. Then that person will bypass this 30% tax, right? Similarly, if there is a corporation which can show zero profit, yet it is making, let's say, $3 billion of profit. So this person has to utilize this money. Or let's say these profits are in form of some cash or in form of some assets. So excessive profits, then excessive revenues, then high taxation. Now let's look at high taxation. So let's say there are two countries, comparable countries. Let's take Bangladesh. So let's say in Bangladesh, and this is just an example. So let's say the corporate tax is 20% in Bangladesh, and Vietnam it is 15%. Now if I am setting up a plant and I have to set up that plant in Bangladesh, then I would not like to pay 20% tax. So I would incorporate a company, let's say in Cayman Islands, and I will transfer the ownership or do some corporate layering so I'll create a complex structure so that somehow I avoid paying 20%, or I may just avoid Bangladesh altogether and shift to Vietnam if I want to run a fair business. Why? Because my profits are being crunched because of excessive taxation. Now let's say the difference is as high as 30% and 1%. Let's say some tax havens, and let's say some emerging economy. Then what happens? So I would use some form of tax planning as well as some form of corporate layering. So let's say one company owns another company, two subsidiaries. This subsidiary is holding the majority of revenues, but 51% of stake in this company is with a holding company in Mauritius. So what happens? This company is earning the most amount of revenue, but ownership is in Mauritius. So what happens? So Mauritius company will ask for some royalty. So it is just royalty on paper, and this will give me a method to transfer the excess profits or revenues, right? So any corporation would go for tax avoidance, tax planning. Why? Why to pay 30% if you can get your work done in 1%, right? Then organized crime. So if I am, let's say, drug running, so whether I am talking about drugs, I am talking about arms, or let's say I am going for human trafficking, I am going for, let's say, pharma based, or I am going for, let's say, smuggling, or I am involved in any form of, let's say, dacoity, extortion, or even terrorism. So what I would want that my money should be hidden from the authorities, because the moment there is a financial trail, what happens? You can build a case and you can arrest these people. But if I can layer, if I can protect all my money, all my cash holdings, all my assets through any of such methods, then what happens? I'll be able to save myself. And that is why, naturally, by design, if your work is illegal, so naturally, the output, the income from work will also be illegal or illicit. And so this illicit money or wealth you will have to save, protect from authorities, and therefore you will have to go for money laundering. And that is why multiple times, multiple governments around the world, they have come with self-declarations so that people can get one-time waivers from if they have committed such crimes. Then white collar crime. Let's say I am going for stock manipulation, or I am going for a pump and dump of a stock, or I am going for, let's say, round tipping. So sophisticated crimes. Take the example of, let's say, the Harshad Mehta scam, Abdul Karim Telgi scam. So all those scams can be partly white collar, right? And therefore there will be some amount of money laundering to save some of your assets. Then political corruption. Naturally, if we have political corruption, that means in form of, let's say, bribes, or let's say some collusion, or let's say through some benami. So I will have to save the money. that I have earned through any illicit transaction, right? Now, there are three steps, and this is a traditional definition of money laundering, given that the sophistication and internet and the technologies, the cutting edge technology that we see today. So, these three steps may not necessarily be there, but there are these three steps in traditional study of money laundering. So, first is placement. So, in placement, what I'll do is I will inject the dirty money into the legitimate financial system. So, let's say I am having 10 lakhs. So I am somehow using some corporations to inject 1 lakh each into these corporations. Then these corporations, let's say, they will send 5,000 to multiple people through, let's say, UPI, right? And finally, these people might buy the shares of this company. So look at this example and let's try to understand through example that what do we mean by placement, layering and integration. So let's say I have a company and this company goes for injection of money into some entities. These entities in turn inject this money into multiple bank accounts. And let's say all these people whose bank accounts have been used, they again buy the shares of this company. So what will happen? So this company's share will be going high and high. Why? Because every time I am earning some excess profit, the company is transferring this into 10 shell companies, and these shell companies are distributing it to, let's say, 1,000 people, and those 1,000 peoples will buy the shares of this company. So what will happen? So naturally, this type of layering, integration, placement will help improve the stock prices, right? Also, this is also a good example of round tipping. Let's take an example. Let's say there is a company back in Delhi. This Delhi company transfers some money to 3 entities based in Cayman Islands. The 3 entities in Cayman Islands, they again take the FII route, FPI route to buy the shares of this company. So what will happen? Excess profits I am transferring. And what argument will I use to transfer this money? So I'll say there is service agreement. These 3 companies, they are the owner of this company in Delhi. So that is why I have to transfer profits to my owner, and therefore they'll be taxed in Cayman Islands, right? So all those legitimate, illegitimate methods as well as tax loopholes are utilized time and again, not only in India but across the world to do the same transactions. Methods. So fronts. Let's say I open a shop in, let's say, Connaught Place, and I'm making absolutely no money, but I have a lot of cash which is coming from, let's say, my real estate business. So what I'll show, I will use inflated bills to show massive amount of sales in this particular shop, and I will say that the sales are in cash. Then smurfing is, let's say I break 10 lakh rupees I have to launder. So what I'll do is I'll break it into 5,000 rupee small pieces. So multiple small pieces. So let's say I want to launder. So I'm laundering with only 5,000 per person. So smurfing, breaking very large amount of cash using people as mules. Then cash smuggling, directly smuggling cash across borders. This happens US, Mexico. This happens with drug cartels, right? Then hawala. So this is an old method, but now it has become very popular. Why? Because nobody wants to pay 20%, so they would rather use the hawala route to transfer their money abroad. So what do I do? So let's say I go to a market in Delhi and I say I want to transfer 5 lakh to my friend in Abu Dhabi. right? Why? Because I will be going to Abu Dhabi in a month, and I'll use that money there to travel, etc., right, to buy some expensive gadgets, etc., or some other legitimate reason. So 5 lakh I've sent from Delhi. So this person, this Hawala operator, he will give me a code. Now, when I go back to, let's say, the market in Abu Dhabi, then I will meet with the other trader. I will again give the code to this person, or my friend can directly give the code and take the 5 lakh rupees there itself. So, whenever we are sending or receiving remittances, Hawala route is now extensively being used. And because of the secrecy, the model of code, it becomes very easy to go for Hawala. And let's say the tax is charging 5% or 2%, and I will charge only 0.1%. So it's cost competitive also. Round tipping, usually used by companies. Why? To first transfer excess profits and then to reintegrate it back into their companies through multiple corporate layers, multiple subsidiaries, different holding companies. Then cryptocurrency, how come? So before it was regulated, cryptocurrency became a prized possession for money launderers. Why? Because you don't need any KYC, etc. Now, over the period of time, the nose is tightening on on cryptocurrency, and the value of cryptocurrency is going down. So what happens is that in this time, there has been too much regulation, not only in India, but across the world. So this nose has to be tightened. Why? Because cryptocurrency was being used to pump, let's say, organized crime as well as terrorism. And India is very stern on both these crimes. Then let's say we are investing in gems, golds, collectibles. Let's say I am saving my money by buying a lot of Rolex watches, or let's say some form of paintings, right? Some art records or some music records. Then I am going for, let's say, real estate, cars, boats, by using again shell companies as well as by going for Benami transactions. And shell companies, a lot of shell companies have been found out and they have been removed. More than 2 lakh shell companies, they have been removed from MCA. Why? Because they were being used by other companies for, let's say, transfer of money. So let's say this Hawala operator, another Hawala operator. So they have some monthly work, they have some monthly revenue, right? So all the Hawala operators, they are pulling it through a corporate structure to send the money, because money has to go finally to Abu Dhabi, to Dubai, right? So through corporate structures, through use of tax havens where tax is extremely low, finally money will flow. But it will be a mix of both sophisticated as well as traditional methods. Now, the ways that we counter money laundering is through acts like PMLA Act, which gives the authority to Enforcement Directorate to take actions on such crimes. Then FIU under Ministry of Finance. Then the ED has the power to attach your properties. And the Supreme Court held that the extraordinary powers that ED has, it is requisite with the crimes. That means these are essentially white collar crimes. But they somehow deplete the democratic system. Why? Because it breeds corruption, it breeds wrongdoing. So it eats the system, the democratic setup, the institutions like termites, right, from within. Then globally, we are looking at the G7 initiative of Financial Action Task Force, right? Then we are also talking about a global minimum taxation, so that the differential between, let's say, India taxing at 20-25% and let's say a tax haven taxing at, let's say, 1%. So there should be a global minimum tax, so that this benefit that the companies enjoy, and that is why large companies, even companies like FANG, so FANG, MANG, all these companies, Facebook, Amazon, or Meta, Amazon, they all go for, let's say, Ireland, British Isles, then Cayman Islands, Mauritius. So they use multiple corporate structures, patenting structures, and sophisticated accounting to transfer the profits. And majority of billion-dollar companies, they would try to show zero profits, right? Then naturally awareness within institutions, within companies, as well as within citizens. And then the use of big data, artificial intelligence, as well as sophisticated tech to find such patterns and emerging patterns. Finally, also looking at data integration when we are looking at economic data. So AI, ML based and using big data, we can look at such patterns and identify them preemptively. Then we must go for international cooperation when it comes to prosecuting these economic offenders, as well as sharing information about, let's say, corporate structures, who is the beneficial owner, etc. Right? So we have to go for information sharing instruments with friendly countries, while also targeting a global minimum taxation. Now, let's look at the third article, and this pertains to your corruption. Now, what is corruption? It is basically use of public office for personal gain. Now, let's look at what is corruption. So India stands at 85th position amongst 180 countries in Corruption Perception Index. Then Robert Kidgard gave this definition that corruption is equal to monopoly. So let's say I give a particular person, a particular company, or an individual absolute monopoly on a particular sector, on decision making, right? Then I give discretion to take any decision. You can do anything. And I do not disclose anything about my decision making or how I arrived at that decision making. So what it will do? It will breed corruption. And transparency, as we have already discussed, is an antidote to corruption. Openness and transparency is must in governance so that it improves citizen participation and it builds a proactive democracy. Now, there are two types of corruption. One is petty. So let's say I go for booking of a ticket and someone asks for 100 rupees or 1000 rupees for getting a confirmed ticket. Petty corruption. Big ticket corruption. Let's say I invest 1000 crore in a political party. So I ask 5-6 leaders of the political party that either one of you should become, let's say, the chief minister of a state. And once you are in the power, you return this with interest in form of, let's say, tenders. So just give me tenders of 10,000 crores. So big ticket or collusive corruption. And this is a global phenomenon. Now, the issue, so even if we are able to solve, let's say, petty corruption through e-governance, the biggest issue is big ticket corruption. And best examples are, let's say, the 2G spectrum, then coal allocation in India, right? Big ticket corruption, then Commonwealth Games. So when corruption permeates in each of government tenders, all government projects, where there is substandard building quality, failure of bridges, which we see on a daily basis. During monsoon, we'll see multiple bridges will collapse or newly built roads will collapse suddenly because of poor quality of engineering, poor quality of material use. So what do we see? We see big ticket corruption. So a nexus between, let's say, politicians, between bureaucrats, between business. So what happens? All of them scratch each other's back to make more money, right? And again, it is a termite. It acts like a termite for wood. And what is this wood? Wood is the institution of democracy, right? And individual institutions, let's say the executive, legislature, the judiciary, anywhere which we find that there is corruption and big ticket corruption, then what happens? the institutional quality, it depreciates. Now, what are the reasons for corruption? So, political. When we look at political reasons, so criminalization. So, the moment I say criminalization of politics, let's say we built a parliament with 30 to 50% of legislators having criminal cases, and let's say 10% of our legislators, they have murder charges. So what happens? So usually it again will breed more corruption. Why? Because I have criminalized the political system. I am using more and more criminals in the political system. Then I am also using the muscle and money power. So examples like, let's say, Bahubalis or strongman. I have multiple criminal cases. Then crony capitalism, where let's say businesses, they start funding a political party or a candidate so that there is quid pro quo post winning of election. Economic reasons can be inequality. Let's say 60% of India is holding 60% of wealth. Then it is more egalitarian. But let's say the top 10% of India, if they hold 90% of India's wealth, then what happens? So this is a classic case of inequality, right? Now, other forms of inequality can be regional inequality. Let's say we are comparing coastal Maharashtra with interior Maharashtra. Or let's say we are comparing Maharashtra versus development of Assam. So what do we see? Economic disparity, regional disparity, right? Then we have red tapeism rather than red carpet, and that is why we are targeting the ease of doing business. When we are talking about ethics, the idea of need versus greed. So we are now focusing more on greed. Why? Because individualism has increased. We are more concerned about our individuality, individual identities. And over the period of time with free market economy, we have also become more materialistic, thereby sidelining our ancient ethical diktats. Then we are looking at administrative structure. So colonial legacy, it means what? That let's say there is more discretion. More discretion is provided to administration, and more situational discretion is there. Why? Because the idea of administration was to rule, not to govern. So rule over the people. Then the lack of reforms or slow reforms. One of the reasons for slow reforms can be the diversity. The diversity of, let's say, that we see between states, between regions. So while reforms have happened, but administrative reforms are extremely slow. And a very good example is that very recently we are discussing criminal law amendments, right? So 75 years passed, but we have not gone away from the ideas of Macaulay, right? Then data integration. So we have a lot of physical data and we have digital data, right? But this physical and digital data, they have not been integrated. Furthermore, within the physical data, there are multiple data sets. Let's say the state government has something, some institution has something, some government of India has something, and multiple wings, multiple departments will have different data. And then there will be digital data. So all that data has not been integrated, and therefore what happens? A person who is doing corruption, let's say in Delhi, will buy a land in, let's say, Jharkhand or Assam through Benami transactions, right? Using cash. So all those things are because data integration is slow, and naturally anyone who is part of the system will try to avoid it. Then judicial delays. then low wages. So whenever the incentive of corruption is much high, then the incentive to be a good citizen, let's say all the benefits are being accrued and all the incentives are being given to the corrupt, then what happens? The incentive to become good or to remain a good individual, ethical individual also decreases. And that is why we need to promote and we need to look at promoting the honesty amongst individuals and in citizens. And honesty must be appreciated rather than dishonesty. Now, what is the way forward? So we have to look at a host of reforms, whether it is legal, whether it is judicial, whether it is about economics, whether it is about ethics. So ethics in public administration must be primordial and it has to be systematically promoted. That means punish the wrongdoers while promote the honest. Then reposing faith on citizens, that the citizens will do good. Regarding judiciary, we have to go for fairness in appointment and also looking at the judicial delays. When we have the legal methods, so we have acts like, let's say PMLA, Money Laundering Act, then Prevention of Corruption Act, then we have the Lokayukta Act. So multiple laws are there that take care of corrupt activities. Then whenever we are talking about economics, we can look at free market with more private participation, with more innovation, simultaneously looking at fair market. So not letting players go for abuse of dominance, not letting markets to create, let's say, oligopolies or monopolies. So fairness in market, right? Now let's look at treated water, and this pertains to your GS3. Now during G20, treated water will be used for fountains. Why? Because we have to use our wastewater, treated water and grey water, because India is staring at water stress and water scarcity. Now let's appreciate that India has 2.5% of world's surface area with 4% of water and with 16% of population and with 18% of livestock population. That makes it unsustainable to use, let's say, the normal drinking water or our tap water for fountains. And therefore, this can become a good case study of how India is using its grey water in terms of its other usage. Now, ORF says that with this particular rate of growth, that is 2.8% per year, there is growth in demand for water. There will be a supply gap of 50% by 2030 only. And over the period of time, we are seeing that there is continuous decline in the per capita availability of drinking water. That is why we have gone for piped drinking water to every household, because it is part of life, livelihood, and the basic rights of an individual. Now, what are the sources of grey water? So it can be your industries, it can be the sewage, it can be about surface water. So for sewage, we have STPs, sewage treatment plants, and these STPs, the water that comes out, let's say fertilizers are coming, then water is, so the same water can be again used in, let's say, industries, or can be used in, let's say, construction. So reuse, recycled, reduce is the way forward. Now the best example is of Singapore, which uses 40%. So 40% of Singapore's water use comes from recycled water. Also, a lot of countries like Israel, they go for complete usage, complete recycling of their used water. And so they will use their treated water in, let's say, agri activities, right? And that too through drips. So these are two good examples, and India is also taking such strides to use treated water in non-essential applications of water. Let's look at the Aditya L1 mission, and this pertains to your GS3. So the launch vehicle that we have used is PSLV, Polar Satellite Launch Vehicle XL. Now let's look at the mission. So firstly, it is ISRO's maiden expedition to study the sun. First from ISRO to study sun. Then it is the second astronomy observatory class mission after AstroSat. And we must know what is a Lagrange point. So it is a position in space where gravitational force of the sun and the earth produced enhanced regions of attraction and repulsion. And we have 5 Lagrange points, L1 to L5. Then what are the objectives? So we must at this point of time appreciate that in the backdrop we are looking at issues of climate change and how climate change will evolve and how it will affect us as humans. So we must look at the sunspot cycle, we must look at the corona. So corona is the outermost layer, and just below the corona is the chromosphere. So we must look at sun, how its radiation, heat, how particles are flowing, what kind of magnetic fields are there. We must study corona, chromosphere, which is the innermost layer, then coronal mass injection. And what is coronal mass injection? It is large expulsion of plasma and magnetic fields from sun's corona. Then we must look at the solar winds and what do we achieve from this. So we will look at multiple climatic events which are affecting humans, but more importantly it lets India be in the big league with NASA and European Space Agency. And the moment we study sun, we are also moving beyond the moon, and eventually such technological strides will help us to go for manned mission, right? And if we understand space weather, if we understand how sun behaves, so it will help in better prediction of local phenomena which are associated with sun, right? Thank you so much. I hope it helped.